preserving individual rights. That is the context of the entire Bill of Rights. Doug?
Yeah, I think it's important to note that the concern of the Danbury Baptists was exactly the concern of those who were opposed to having a Bill of Rights. That by virtue of the fact of it even appearing in there, assumed that government had a right to regulate certain things. And so their concerns were in fact the concerns of those who were opposed to a Bill of Rights. They weren't opposed to people having those rights. They were opposed to having the legal document that described what government could do, even mentioning those rights, because it could then be assumed that the government had the right to regulate or change the regulation on those rights.
Yeah. Okay, so why am I telling you this about the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment in particular? It's because the entire context screams out for not the Establishment Clause being at war with the Free Exercise Clause. They're supposed to work together, as Jeff will elaborate on.
No, I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
You said that the Bill of Rights basically tries to outline what government can do. Is it?
Oh, what it can't do to...
Okay, yeah, that's what I was going to say. Isn't it mostly or all negative toward government? I mean, and basically it's limiting government in every case. So it's supposedly preserving our rights by limiting the rights of or abilities of government.
Right.
Okay, I don't know. Are there any amendments that actually are quote unquote, positive powers of government?
You can read those.
I think it is interesting that they're the opposite of the rest of the Constitution, because the rest of the Constitution delineates what the federal government may do. And the Bill of Rights is all about what the federal government definitely may not do.
Right. Debbie?
Okay, since Jeff asked the question, now I can answer the question. I'll blame him on
You didn't have to wait for Jeff, by the way. But.
Okay, I'm burning here inside to find out who was on the Supreme Court in 1947 and when was this split, because putting together my reading, I'm seeing a 1 + 1 = 2. Yeah, equation here. So do you know?
I don't remember what the composition of the court was. I think the Everson decision was written by Chief Justice Vinson, I think. But that information's out there. So.
Well, I think the other thing to remember is that that court was one that was largely shaped by FDR, right? And it was after his attempt to, in fact, increase the membership in the court so that they would stop calling all of his New Deal legislation unconstitutional.
Yeah. So anyway, again, I was taught these two religion clauses are at war with each other. The reality is they're supposed to work together. And the Supreme Court has pretty much lost track of that. Now let's talk a little bit about the Establishment Clause. Again, as I emphasized a moment ago, the idea here is to limit the ability of Congress to establish a national church. Okay? That's it. Doug.
What does establish mean, Herb?
What does establish mean?
Yeah.
Well,
in other words, the longest English word we have is anti-establishmentarianism.
Yeah. Well, again, think of the context for, how our nation was birthed. In England, the Anglican Church was the official state church. And everybody, there were a lot of people that came to the colonies over the course of a number of years who were trying to get away from the established church because they didn't necessarily drink the same Kool-Aid. Okay? John?
Question about that. I know, during the founding era, the fight was over the fact that the legislature of England was making laws for this equal and separate colony over here, and that was the mix of powers that shouldn't happen. So there was the there was the crown, the king, the queen, whatever, who was over, the Isle of Man and the Isle of Guernsey and Scotland and Ireland, or Northern Ireland at least, and England and the colonies in America. How was the Anglican Church related to it? Was the Anglican Church kind of like the Queen in that it was over all of these? Or did England have its own Anglican sovereignty over them, and then Scotland would have their own religious
That's
wing?
an excellent church history question that I think you ought to research thoroughly.
Yeah, well, I've never thought of it that way before. You guys are bringing out that idea. What was the deal about that? Because I know part of the reason for the revolution was they were afraid the Anglicans were going to of England were going to try to grab sovereignty over them and send a bishop over to tell them what to do.
Well, where the Episcopalian Church came from is it was basically Anglican, but without any of its hierarchy appointed by the Church of England. And so that's where the Anglican Church, that's where the Episcopalian Church in America came from. And so, but even in England, even though they had an established church, you had the nonconformists, right? People like John Bunyan and people like that who for a while were getting put in prison and all of that kind of stuff. So they still had what they called nonconformists in England. But the real, I guess what I was trying to get Herb to say was that establishment meant that they were supported by public funds, by tax money. All right, so all of the...
He didn't put the question to me clearly enough.
Who's your boss? Who signs your checks?
He's blame shifting. Anyway.
Who signs the
So
checks?
you're saying with the establishment, it had to do with monies as well?
That was a huge part of it, yeah.
Okay.
Because they were the established church was always the one that received public funds, and this was even true in the colonies.
Yeah.
And one of the big things that was changing as a result of the Great Awakening is that more and more of the churches were becoming independent of that public source of funding. And of course, that whole, if another 20th century example of how that was a negative thing was how Hitler was able to co-opt the Lutheran Church, because in Germany, the Lutheran Church was the established church. All of the Lutheran pastors were paid by the national government, and so all Hitler had to really do was say, "Well, would you guys like to keep your jobs?" And so and of course Bonhoeffer and the others started the Confessing Church as a result of that, but they had quite an uphill battle because they had a whole issue of a country that had been trained to expect that their pastors would be covered from their tax money.
So the Church of England, those priests or whoever they were paid by
The king.
the king. Okay.
And the other thing to keep in mind is a lot of the colonies did in fact have established state churches.
Right.
Okay. So the idea of the government contributing money to a church was not a foreign concept by any means, and it wasn't something that they avoided at all costs, but they didn't want Congress telling everybody this is going to be the official national denomination, in part because they all had a bunch of different ones already. So again, context matters. You have to understand where they were coming from, what the problem was that they were trying to address, and how they chose to come at that. So I was just waiting to see if Doug really knew what the establishment was all about. That's why I wouldn't rise to debate. But Jeff?
Real briefly, did a lot of the states eliminate their established churches fairly early on and open it up so that...
Another excellent church history question.
I could tell you the answer, but I think you should look it up yourself.
Yes.
I mean, over time, that obviously became less and less of a, and even in more modern times, I mean, there's a lot of universities, colleges and universities that get federal student aid money and federal funds through other sources, and they've all unhinged and severed official ties with the churches, the denominations that started them, with some exceptions, but that's generally the case.
You guys are kicking out really good questions here, because one thing I'm thinking of, that establishment then in the Constitution really refers back to this tax support of the church, not just did they say, well, we like this denomination.
That's
It's
right.
about where the money goes. Now,
Right.
the other question is, in that early founding period, we didn't have personal income taxes. We didn't have family income taxes, right? So all this money coming to the churches was, paying the pastors was coming from the excise tax or the tariffs or some of the just little tiny taxes that were
Yeah.
at the state and federal level. So it wasn't really even the family paying tithe to the church either, right?
Well, they did, I mean, the churches certainly, people gave money to the churches directly as well. And it depended, because in the period from about 1720 to 1830 or thereabouts, you have this mixture going on, where more and more churches are actually choosing, or in many cases, it's because many of the churches are starting up under religious freedom who are not part of that state's established church. And so they all have to learn,
Wing
if
it.
you will, to fund themselves through offerings given by those who go. It's only the, I think it was a Congregational church, I'm trying to remember, in Massachusetts, who got their pastors funded. And so all the other churches all had to be funded through the voluntary gifts or offerings of their membership.
So there was probably a high level apportionment of public money to the denomination, and then the denomination took care of paying the church.
Yeah, I don't know the
something like
exact mechanisms.
Great question study, yeah.
So,
Well, also the judiciary committees in the House and Senate and Congress in 1853 and 1854, they quoted some of what they said today, but they also defined what establishment was. And they said, there were religious tests involved, there were doctrines involved also, that you had to swear allegiance to in the establishment of a religion. So it wasn't just the taxes.
To get your paycheck.
Well, to belong to the church and to be part of that whole
to be a
establishment.
minister of that church.
Yeah, to get the favor of the government because you were part of that church. And so there were other levels of it too. It wasn't just the taxes, but yes, taxes were part of it.
And you'll see that in some of the early constitutions. When the states, after 1776, after the Declaration of Independence, all the states had to come up with their own constitutions. And so one of the things that they were concerned about, and in fact, if you go back and you read some of the debates over the original Constitution and stuff like that, they were worried that that this establishment thing could cause the federal government to tell these states that they can't have the religious tests anymore. And many of the states did have religious tests written into their constitution about who could serve as public officials. Not even, it wasn't even so much about who could be pastors, it was about who could serve as a public official.
Right. Which we all recall from our study of the U.S. Constitution, no religious oath is required.
Religious test.
Yeah. So, and how many of you were aware that the U.S. Capitol served as a church? Okay. And the Treasury Building and a bunch of others, okay? The point that